Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Worcestertown. We are here tonight to celebrate Homemade, recipes and stories from Winnipeg and Beyond, published by the Winnipeg Free Press and written and compiled by Eva Wasney. This is you may applaud. This is a community cookbook celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Free Press and the newspaper's long tradition of recipe sharing and home cooking journalism, with deeply researched archival stories and 150 submitted recipes from cooks across the province. And rather than being a historical document, this is very much a living book full of beautiful pictures of food, insightful stories, and so many contributions to the Winnipeg community. It's such a delight to have all of you folks gathered here physically to celebrate the book's publication, and of course, for all those watching online, gathered virtually. I am the least interesting part of this evening, so I will exit the stage momentarily. I just have a few thrilling housekeeping notes before I leave. So to give you an idea of how the event will go along, there'll be a conversation that will take place to my left, featuring Eva in conversation with Jill Wilson, also of the Winnipeg Free Press. Following their conversation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, both you physically here and you watching online. If you're watching online, just write your questions into the chat and we'll get to them as time permits. If you're gathered here, just to ensure that all of our virtual guests can hear you, I'll ask you to ask me the question, which I will then repeat into the microphone. And we'll get that game of telephone going until Eva can actually answer. As I will not do justice to the eloquence of your questions, we ask that you do keep them fairly brief and keep them as questions. Rest assured you'll have ample time during the actual signing to further interrogate Eva or offer any further feedback that you might have. With that in mind, at the end of the event, I'll ask you to remain in place for just one moment while we safely transport Eva to the signing table, at which point you may all join her over there and get your book signed. And rest assured, I'll have more exciting details about how the signing is going to go at the end of the evening, so look forward to that. But now I have the inestimable pleasure of introducing both of our guests here this evening. Eva Wasney is an award-winning journalist born and raised here in Winnipeg. She writes about creativity in its many forms as a food arts and life reporter with the Winnipeg Free Press. When she's not hunched over a keyboard writing to deadline, Eva can be found exploring the outdoors and making haphazard recipe substitutions in the kitchen. Your host this evening, Jill Wilson, is a copy editor and theater reviewer at the Winnipeg Free Press and the author of the weekly arts newsletter, Applause. Please join me in welcoming Eva Wasney.
Hello. It's so lovely to see so many people out here tonight. And maybe before we start, I'm just curious how many people are here because they submitted a recipe to the book. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
I would like to apologize for not being Jen Zarati, who was supposed to be hosting. I hope you're not too disappointed. I'm a copy editor of the Free Press, and I actually edited a lot of the stories that Eva wrote before they went into the book. So I've been interested in this project for a long time. So I'm excited to talk to her about it.
Yeah.
So how did you come to develop the concept of this book? I mean, it's to celebrate the Free Press's 150, but it's kind of an interesting slant to take on 150 years of the Free Press. How did you?
Yeah, so it was a couple different projects, streams that I was working on. So during the pandemic, I pitched this series called Homemade, and it was about local chefs and kind of what they made at home while restaurants were closed and things like that. And so that was the Homemade stream, and that morphed obviously when restaurants opened and chefs were no longer at home making amazing food for themselves. They were back to eating cereal and things like that after their shift. And then I had also been I'd just been interested in looking through our archives to try and come up with some food related anniversary stories for the 150th anniversary, and just got really hooked on the idea about like recipe sharing and food journalism within the Free Press. And so these two things came together, and I also was very interested in doing a community cookbook that celebrated the community and recipe sharing, which has been such a big part of the paper's tradition for almost 150 years. So yeah, that's kind of how it all came together. It was a lot of different ideas that kind of came into this one project.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone's had a chance to look at the book, but sort of interspersed between the recipes are individual stories focusing on local people who have special recipes and special stories to tell. It's not just about the food, it's about the culture that brings that food. How did you find those people that you chose to highlight in the book?
Yeah, so it was interesting. I had kind of gone, for some of them, it was people that I had had conversations with about different stories, people I had interviewed for other kind of stories that I had written, and they had said something about a food related topic that kind of piqued my interest. And so some of them were just reaching back into my kind of Rolodex and looking for folks. Other people other stories came from submissions. Others came from the Facebook group that we started to kind of like make this project happen and kind of drum up interest. So lots of different spaces, and I knew I wanted to do a bunch of different kind of stories that looked at Winnipeg food and the way people eat and what they eat and why, and really kind of dive deep into some of those stories.
I also think like one of my favorite stories that you wrote before it became the book is about Madeline Day, who was the Free Press's first food economist. How did you latch onto her story?
Well, I had been, so this was during my archive digging, and so I found her mentioned many different times. She just kept popping up in searches about recipes. And so I knew that she was this integral figure in the 1930s. And she was a bit of a, I like to think of her as an influencer of the day. She was very much kind of recommending what people eat and really influencing the tastes of Winnipeg in that time period. Because she was a woman who I later discovered had been doing these cooking schools all over the place and kind of landed in Winnipeg and brought the concept here. And she would have these events, and they would have thousands of women and homemakers and things like that show up at the Winnipeg Auditorium. And she would be doing demonstrations, cooking demonstrations and things like that, and hawking products. And it was all like to get the homemakers interested in buying certain, say, like cutlery or like dishes or china from different spots in town. And so it very much had an advertorial kind of bench to it. But one of the things, and the recipe ended up in this book, one of the funniest things that kind of caught my attention about her was a recipe she shared during one of her first cooking schools in Winnipeg, and it was for a banana meatloaf. And I was like, what? with bacon, don't forget, with bacon, it must have bacon. And so that kind of stuck in my head, and I was very confused about this recipe. Like, why in the 1930s, Depression era Winnipeg was this woman cooking with bananas and bacon and like ground meats and stuff like that. But this was like a featured dish. It was like the big to-do at this cooking school. And so it's like the presentation, and there's a write-up in the paper about how all of the women in the auditorium oohed and awed at the presentation of this banana meatloaf. And it was like fascinating. So
well, and Eva actually recreated it and brought it into the newsroom, and we've tried it, and it was surprisingly kind of delicious.
It turns out fruit and ground meats is like it's not a crazy combination. Yeah, I did have to make it because I was just so curious what it would taste like, and then I forced my colleagues to try it too.
I actually kind of crave it a little bit. Like I think about it sometimes. I'm not gonna make it.
Well, I mean, my editor Scott went back for I think third, so it was a hit.
I think that that kind of recipe sort of illustrates too what's interesting about the story you're telling here, which is the way that food has changed over the years. Like I think if you looked at really old recipes, they'd be all food from the land or food that you could harvest yourself. Then you sort of got into like wartime, deprivation era food, and then they move more into processed, like, cream of mushroom soup style cooking. And I think that there's a shift back probably to more local focused recipes.
Yeah, I think so. I think now, just with the way the world is, local food is all the rage, and kind of going to the farmer's market and things like that is pretty popular way to cook and way to source your ingredients and things like that. But yeah, it is very interesting, and to be able to look back through the lens of the newspaper and the kind of things that we were including in the paper, all the way back. So this starts with the first recipe that was ever published in the Free Press, and it was a bison soup recipe that included pemmican as a main ingredient. And so that was published in, I think it was 4 years after the founding of the paper, and it was published as a letter to the editor. And it's this tiny little clipping. It's not even a full recipe as you would think of it today, but I really wanted to kind of chat with some folks about pemmican, the history, why it's so important to this province, and dig into that. And so we can start all the way back in the late 1870s with recipes running in the paper, and then all the way up to today. And so many people that I talked to about this project and who reached out to me to submit things, so many people said that the recipes are still their favorite part of the paper. And there's so many people that clip recipes and keep them and have collected their grandma's clippings and inherited those. And so it's a really neat kind of history and local history too.
When I think you're talking about Madeline Day being an influencer, I think the recipe swap era at the paper was kind of also a pre-internet chat group where it felt like people were talking to each other. We'd have the same, I used to edit that section, and it would be the same people submitting every 3 weeks. Edna Morose, I talked to Edna Morose, who was a very faithful contributor, and Yvonne Carroll, I think, was another one from Selkirk. It was like a conversation they'd be having, and people would ask for recipes like the Rose brand flour pie crust, and then someone would have clipped that and saved it. And I mean, if you subscribe to the New York Times now, you'll see the same kind of things going on in the comment section, where people are having an entirely separate conversation from the recipe. They've gone off to just chat amongst themselves. So there's something about talking about food that brings that out in people, I think.
Absolutely. And I will say, for any recipe swap faithfuls, if you were into that column, I did get to speak to Edna Morose over the phone. She's doing great, not cooking as much as she used to, but there is a little interview with her in there. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there is something about food and recipe sharing specifically. Like, cooking is such an act of love. You get to cook a dish and you share it with somebody, but then sharing a recipe, like the source of that love is like just so special. And it's amazing how many people, and we can get into some of the anecdotes that are included in here too, because within the recipes, on the submission form, we had asked people if they wanted to share a little bit about the dish and why it was important to them and things like that. And so many people wrote in with personal stories about like why this dish is important, who it came from, why they love eating it, what it makes them think of. And so I wasn't going to do a reading because it's very like reading a bunch of ingredients and directions would be very interesting, but I will read just a couple of the anecdotes because I think they're very sweet. So this one is very funny, and like I loved all of them, but some of them just stick in my mind, and this is one of them. So this is for a tomato shrimp aspic. And so this is a Jello-based dish. And I will say we received, so in total, we received about 400 recipe submissions for this project, which like blew my mind entirely. A lot of them included Jello. So I didn't include all of them in here. Couldn't include all of the Jello salads, but needed to for posterity, obviously. So this is Darlene Smith's tomato shrimp aspic. And she writes that this was my mother, Edith Parker's recipe, which she made for all family celebrations. We would always request her aspic, and she continued to make it well into her 80s. Before she eventually had cataract surgery in both eyes, she accidentally scooped a small rubber band from the green onions into the dish without knowing it. We teased her so much that from that point on, she would place a rubber band on top of the salad whenever she made the aspic. To this day, we still enjoy a laugh about Graham's tomato shrimp aspect mishap. Maybe I'll just read one more. Let's see. The other nice thing was about like we received a very wide diversity of recipes, and it's just so wonderful because I think it really showcases the diverse community that exists in Winnipeg, and it's just so lovely. And so this one is for tangy chana masala with cool cucumber raita, and this is Charluta Gupta's recipe. She writes, I'm an Indo-Canadian and come from the Punjab region. Even though I grew up in the western region of India, I grew up eating Punjabi food. I learned cooking from my mother, and when I immigrated to Winnipeg, cooking Punjabi food made me feel at home. And when I had my daughter, I wanted her to relish the food that I grew up eating. This dish is simple, chickpeas cooked to perfection with various spices, onions, and herbs. And so food is just so important to people. And it's just every single kind of anecdote and story that I was able to report on just really drove that point home for me. And it was, yeah, that was, I think, the loveliest part of this project.
Yeah. I think another thing I noticed about it is sort of, like you said before, is that there's a diversity. And I wonder if you think that by reading this, you sort of get a snapshot of Manitoba. Do you think the cookbook itself reflects the province?
I think it has to. It's tough because like I've asked other people this, and people have asked me what I think Manitoba cuisine is. And I mean, there's like dishes that people point to as being Manitoba cuisine, but like I don't think generally we have a cuisine. We are such a diverse place, and that's represented in the food that people make at home, and that's kind of what's so special about the recipes in here too.
Now, I know you mentioned a lot of Jello recipes. You also had a lot of borscht.
Lots of borscht recipes, lots of fruitcake recipes, lots of, pierogi recipes and things like that. And so, there was obviously Winnipeg and Manitoba has a very big Ukrainian community, and that was represented in the dishes that we received as well.
And I noticed that you kept the individual spellings of borscht, which I understand are very important to people, whether it's Ukrainian borscht or Russian borscht.
Exactly. I wasn't about to change the spellings of things or anything like that. I think we published the recipes mostly as received, other than maybe doing a bit of fact checking about ingredients and things like that, and quantities and stuff like that. But what you see in the book is largely what people sent in. And I think it was important to stay true to their representations of their food.
Another thing that I noticed is, I mean, I read recipes just for fun. I'd like to, and we were talking about Bon Appetit magazine and how you can't, they look wonderful, but you can't make anything because you're missing 2 ingredients. You'd have to go to some, specialty store. What's so lovely about this is that these are all like home cooking recipes. So you can look at any page and just say, oh, I could actually make that with what I have at home. And the instructions are simple. There's no, my boyfriend won't make a recipe that says meanwhile. And he doesn't like to do 2 things going on. There's not too many meanwhiles.
It's all very straightforward. Absolutely. And the funny thing I noticed, just like people have certain brands that they like to use, obviously, like can't not use tender flake when you're making a pastry kind of thing. And so that is included in here as well. Yeah, the specific brands that people requested. Yeah.
So you're a pretty avid home cook yourself?
Yeah, I do like to cook. Yeah.
What recipe would you have submitted if you had submitted a recipe?
I would have submitted my Bach's borscht recipe. There is way too much competition, so I wouldn't want to make that decision even harder. But yeah, my Bach's borscht, which I have in the fridge currently at the moment. Yeah.
Is it on like a handwritten recipe card? Or
it is. It's a recipe card written by my mom, but transcribed from her mom's recipe.
Yes. I think you should read a couple more.
Yeah.
I
do have a couple more that are flagged here. I think the last 2 I flagged are dessert recipes. So this one is for Marion's Butter Tarts, and this is submitted by Donna McDonald. And it reads, my grandmother was born in 1910 and lived until she was in her 90s. She had a red plastic binder with handwritten, stained recipes in it, and we treasure it to this day. She told me toward the end of her life that the kitchen was her favorite place, her domain, her sanctuary. Not everything she cooked was fabulous. She consistently overcooked beef roasts that were dry and chewy. As a young cook, I once called to ask her for a recipe for beef roast, reasoning that if I could cut the cooking time in half, it would turn out fine. When I called to ask about cooking time, she replied, "Oh my dear, you can never overcook a good piece of beef." But she could bake. She was famous for her peanut butter cookies and most especially her butter tarts. They were frequently requested by friends and family and were mentioned in the eulogy given at her funeral. Yeah, it's very nice. And you can just like feel the love in these anecdotes, and it's just like, I read through every single recipe that was submitted, and like just reading the little personal stories that were included in them was such a treat. Okay, I'll read, this is the last one I'll read. This is for Granny Sinclair's peanut butter muffins. So, and this comes from Joan Sinclair. Every Saturday morning of my childhood and my dad's, my grandmother baked these to serve for anyone stopping by for a visit. They taste of friendship and family togetherness. After she passed away, we found that the recipe was titled Peanut Butter Cupcakes in her recipe book. So I always think of this as my granny's way of sneaking cake for breakfast. Life is short, eat dessert first.
Now, you didn't require people to submit anecdotes with the stories. I think that like the reason you got so many is that food is kind of part of the narrative of our lives. It's the story we tell ourselves about our culture and about our family. Do you think that's reflective in the?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's, I mean, just in the stories that I've read, these are all recipes that have been passed down from loved ones to the next generation kind of thing. And I think that's inheriting those things from people that you love and that have passed on, being able to remember them in food like that. It's absolutely, yeah, it's definitely part of personal history and family history for sure.
Now, there's some cookbooks that you buy and they sort of are a coffee table book. This one feels like it's designed to get dirty and have, you know, tomato thumbprints on it. And,
I already dirtied mine just from like transporting it to the office. Yeah, absolutely. I would love you to crack the spine on this, use it in the kitchen. The wonderful woman who laid this out, Kitty Wong, we were having a conversation about the design and the layout of it. And she made a really good point about white space and that it's important to leave space for people if they want to add their own anecdotes to it and make their own recipe submission or substitutions and things like that. And so I think the design of the book really allows for that within all of the kind of like writing and things like that. There is space for making it your own for sure.
We should also mention that this book helped inspire our upcoming fall supper menu.
Mm-hmm.
So I presume they're going to be a little fancified.
They're going to be a little bit more chefy. Yes. So it apparently wasn't enough to just put out a cookbook this year. We also are doing a fall supper on October 1st. And it's a really fun event. We did one last year, and so we're trying the concept again with a bit of a different theme to it. And so we asked a local chef, his name is Paul Ormond, and we asked him to come up with a menu based on the 150 recipes that are in this book. Super tall ask. He was kind of overwhelmed with it, but excited. And so he's taken a dozen or so as inspiration and has created a 4-course menu, and it's going to be absolutely wonderful. The event takes place at the Ukrainian Labor Temple, which is in the North End on Pritchard Avenue. And it's a beautiful building. If nobody's been there before, it's absolutely lovely. So that's October 1st. We are selling tickets currently. And the other nice thing about the event is that it's a fundraiser for Harvest Manitoba. So $25 from each ticket goes to Harvest, and you get a text receipt at the event as well. Yeah.
We should also mention that there's bus service from the Free Press building, so you can leave your car there and be shuttled in style to the event
via the Winnipeg trolley,
which is very cool.
Yes, it's very cool. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Should we turn it over to questions from the audience?
I think so. Yeah. If anybody has any questions. Hi, Louisa.
I see a question in the back.
And just as a reminder, I'll ask you to ask me the question, which I'll then relay to the microphone. This is an important comment from the back. Her favorite cookies are peanut butter cookies.
Those are very good. I agree.
Is there a peanut butter cookie recipe?
Really? Peanut butter muffins.
That's right.
There might not be a peanut butter cookie recipe in here.
Eva, will your next project be a cookbook exclusively on Jello recipes?
Yeah, that or borscht, 101 borscht recipes.
I said to Eva, that's actually not a bad idea.
I'm sure it would
I
sell.
think it would be good.
There's a lot of variety.
Maybe 100 would be pushing it.
Yeah.
50. 50 favorite portions.
Yes.
For a number of years, there was a column in the Free Press, a recipe swap, and the woman who did it, I can't think of the name, but she was great. Did you consult her, or is she around, or?
So for a number of years, there was a recipe swap column in the Winnipeg Free Press, and the question related to whether or not the author of that column was consulted or whether you chatted with her during writing the book.
Was it Alana
Yes.
Simon? Yeah. Yeah, so I did a story about recipe swap and talked to a lot of the people that were involved, and Alana was one of them. And it was really fascinating. She had, I think it was more than a decade that she had been writing the column as kind of a freelance contributor to the paper. And yeah, we talked a lot about the community that kind of cropped up around that column, and how many, like Jill had mentioned, how many recurring names would be submitted week after week. It would be the same people writing in recipes. And the nice thing she said was that it was often handwritten recipes, and like the same, she could recognize people by their handwriting on envelopes kind of thing. And so she really enjoyed the community aspect of it. It was kind of just like a coffee club kind of thing is the way she described it, I think.
One of the nice anecdotes that Eva has in here too is she talked to Alice. What was Alice's maiden name?
Oh yeah. Kruger.
Thank you, Kruger. Who sort of like, she was the instigator of the recipe swap, and she was a legislative reporter, and she took a break to do home economy writing, and she said it was so much more. People cared about it so much more. They stopped her on the street. When she did interviews with government figures, they would say, "Oh, I need to get that short rib recipe for you."
That's exactly.
It's really.
And that was fascinating to hear, because I think there's a bit of a misconception that this kind of writing, like food journalism, writing about food and things like that, is maybe less important than, say, political journalism or things like that. But this kind of stuff matters to people so much, and it's so evident in interviewing folks like that, and in just seeing the recipes that have come in, for sure.
Will they be serving banana meatloaf?
Will you be serving banana meatloaf at the October 1st dinner?
We will not be serving banana meatloaf, unfortunately, but the recipe is in the book, so I'd recommend you try.
Something in the top 5 first things to try out.
Do you have any recommendations, such as a top 5 things to try out of the book?
Well, that's
Or
a
the top
really
one.
tough question. There is so much. Okay, and so the one thing about this book is that it is not recipe tested for the most part. I tried making a couple dishes, but time-wise, we just couldn't possibly test all of the recipes in this book. So I haven't actually eaten a lot of the food that is in here, but I have, through reporting on doing kind of the longer stories, recipe stories. The best part was going to people's homes and interviewing them in the kitchen, and then getting to try a bite of the dishes. So I mean, I can speak highly of all of the chapter starting recipes. Those ones are all great.
Curious to know that whether there were more than one photographer team, because Michaela McKenzie was the one who photographed, but were there other photographers? Because I really enjoyed the insight with the exchanged with the photographer as well. And we sent her one with, she tasted it.
Yeah, the photographers probably had the better deal of this. They went and took photos of everybody's food and things like that. Yeah, so I think every photographer, every staff photographer for the paper was involved in this project. And so you can see all of their photos in here. And I believe we even have a couple of our regular freelance photographers that were involved in this project too. And I mean, the recipes are great, but being able to pull them together with beautiful photos and things like that, like the photography is absolutely stunning in this. And this is actually a good jumping off point because I did want to thank some of the people that were involved in this. And it really feels funny to have my name on this book because, like I've talked about, this is so much of other people's work and their recipes and things like that. And so thank you to everybody who's contributed something to this. And thank you to my editor, Paul Simin, for greenlighting the project, to my editor, Scott Gibbons, for kind of directing me in the right direction and supporting it. And then we've also got Denise and AV is here as well. And they were just the editors extraordinaire, the level of detail they went into in checking whether amounts were correct and like fact checking things. It was absolutely wonderful. And then Kitty Wong did all the layout and made it look as beautiful as it did. So thank you to everybody involved, and thanks to Jill for also editing so many of these stories.
It was honestly one of my favorite, it was seriously, it was one of my favorite things to read this whole, during, I guess, pandemic was when it started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had the level of detail that you went into with the archival stuff. I had no idea of those stories, and just fascinating. Like I will read this book as a book, as well as try some of the recipes.
Yeah, there's lots of recipes. There's also a lot of narrative in here too, so you could just sit down and read it if you wanted.
Username Crockpot Chic says, "Hi Eva, how long did this book take you to write?"
Very good question. I pitched this idea last summer, I think, and then started working on it in earnest in January of this year. And then it went to the printer in August. So it was about 8 months that we were working on compiling everything, collecting the recipes, editing the recipes, and writing all of the stories as well.
And a mysterious individual named Winnipeg Admin says, "Congratulations, Eva. With the overwhelming response to your request for recipes, do you see a second edition in the future?"
I mean, we certainly have enough content to put on a recipe book. And that is one of the things that like keeps me up at night is the fact that we couldn't include everybody's recipe because these are all so like beloved and special to people. It was very hard to make decisions about what went in and what didn't. But yeah, no plans at the moment, but the recipes may end up in the paper in other forms. Well, that is to be seen, so.
Will you continue doing the sort of features that you've done that go into this?
Yeah, I'd like to. I think a regular feature about recipes and people's stories. Like there's so many other food stories out here that's just scratches the surface. So I think I'd love to continue it on.
Were there any other questions locally? I'm not sure if you had any further questions at all, Jill.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. We talked about the Paul supper. We talked about everything. No, thank you all for coming out. This is, is there one more question?
Yes, indeed.
Is there more details like time and what's going on?
So this is a question for a few more details about the fall supper, time and what's going on. Is there a location or somewhere that people can go to for that information?
Yes, absolutely. So I brought some handouts if I can give you one at the end, but I will go into more detail gladly. There's a lot going on that evening. So it's the dinner, and we've also got beverage sampling from Capital K Distillery and Non-Such Brewing. And Non-Such has created a very special anniversary beer for us, which is going to be available that evening as well. And then we've got a silent auction as well, with all of the funds from that being donated to Harvest. I'm looking over at Aaron, who is co-producing this with me. Is that everything? Okay, that's everything. But yeah, I'll get you a pamphlet with some more information.
And what time is it started?
It starts at about 5 and then I think dinner's at 6 and then ends around 9.
Well, if you folks had any closing comments or anything you might like to say at the end.
Thanks for coming out, and I hope everybody who takes a copy home enjoys cooking the recipes as much as I enjoy reading them, and I'm looking forward to trying a lot more of these myself.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, Eva. So we will be moving along to the signing portion of the evening right now. So again, we'll ask you just to remain in place for one moment. We're going to transport Eva over to a table, which is immediately beside our cash desk. After that, please do feel free to approach the table, have a copy of the book signed. We have copies there, we have copies at our cash desk, copies on display by the entrance. You can get a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. We just ask that you do please pay for the book before you pay. Other than that, you can look forward to Eva's forthcoming book, Aspics and Borscht. And I'd just like to thank one more time at the end you for coming here, for joining us virtually and here in person, for all your wonderful questions, your engagement, to the Winnipeg Free Press for publishing this incredible volume. And I'll ask you to join me one final time in thanking Jill Wilson and Eva Wasney.